Well, it's Tuesday. It is time for Talking Science, as we do every week. Dr. Brad Tucker is with me from the ANU. Brad, thanks for coming back, and thanks for talking science.
No, that's right. It's always a good Tuesday to talk science. It's July, Next week we're gearing up for all things moon, so it should be quite exciting.
It is incredible to see the amount of conversation happening around Apollo 11's 50th and just all the stuff that's coming up, especially down there in Canberra.
That's right. I mean, with a lot of like the formal celebrations and commemorations and then gearing up for a big long event, it's huge, right? And, I was actually chatting on Sunrise the other day, obviously moon conspiracy theories now kind of have a nice rise from the dead. I don't know what they do. But I think one of the cool things that's happening is soon in Australia, the Apollo 11 film comes out. So this is a new movie, and it's like a new type of movie. It's not a documentary, and it's not like a normal Hollywood film, but it's done with entirely pure footage from all of the Apollo stuff. So it's a 90-minute Hollywood film using 100% real footage from the Apollo missions. And so I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to see it for the first time tonight. I had a closed door screening with the producer who's here, and it's going to be cool because you get to show all that little stuff and all those little stories that really put people on the moon 50 years ago almost.
It is incredible. And before we get a little bit further down the road, I do want to mention that if people want to find you, they can pick you up on Twitter at btucker22, and of course Dr. Brad Tucker on Facebook. And you can find little old me on Twitter and Instagram as well, MirrorMatt86. There's a bit of an in-joke there from a Trek podcast a couple of years ago, but I had a goatee, so I became the Mirror Universe version of myself. But there you are. That's where we are on social media. Now, Brad, we've got 4 stories to get through today, so we've got a jam-packed show. First up, the National Film and Sound Archive has received or will be receiving some rare Apollo 11 footage.
That's right. So in a ceremony the other day, what happened is that NASA formally handed over their copy, essentially all of their data, their telemetry, their images, 12 terabytes worth of hard drive data to CSRO as saying, here's all of the official copy of the Apollo stuff. You keep one version. So there are 3 versions of this. And so they said, look, kind of informally, of the role we played, they handed over to CSRO, who then promptly handed it over to National Sound and Film Archive to be archived and preserved into the future.
And it's really cool. Some of the stuff that the NFSA has, it is our cultural identity. A lot of stuff is archived by that museum down in Canberra, and it is a fantastic exhibit if anyone's ever in Canberra to go and check out.
That's right. And so, kind of the important thing here is it's not just those famous images. It's all of the data, all of the links, all of that work for the multiple days of the mission, right? Apollo 11 was more than just those few seconds of Armstrong hopping down the ladder. And so the cool thing is Australia will have a copy. As you said, it's in that great collection. But then more importantly, it will always be updated. So as new formats come out and the way the archive preserves everything, it will keep doing it. So in 20 years, people are like, oh, how do we play the original moon landing footage? I guess we shouldn't have them thrown out the DVD. You don't want... That's right, exactly. You don't want that to happen. Look, from one of the very first space telescopes we built here, in the office next to me is a room half full with old VHS Betamax tapes, because that's what you recorded in 87 and 92. These things happen, and so you have to keep a player with it. So that's a great thing about it being preserved into the future, and it's Australia's copy.
Now, NASA gave the CSIRO a copy of the Apollo 11 landing, but back in the 70s, they decided to sell a copy, or at least sell some footage, for $218 to an intern. And the interns put them away in the garage or in the attic and forgot about them, and has found them a few decades later and decided to sell them at auction, which could net him a couple of million.
So this is the best story. I think this sums up Apollo to the exact degree. And why I say this is people weren't always necessarily thinking about history, right? It was just a job that was done. And this is always quoted that, why aren't Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin more excited and Michael Collins? Well, they were doing a job, and that's what they had to do, just as Apollo 10 and 9 and 8 and so on did before them. But then here, they had copies of it. They're like, all right, we'll just sell all these old tapes to the intern. He could take it away from us to get our rubbish, and we can get a few $100. And then the better part of the story is for I think about 30 years ago, he did sell a bunch of the tapes onto a local TV studio so they could overwrite it and use for, their recordings. And then 3 of them were labeled Apollo EVA. And he's like, all right, I'll hold on to these. And then a couple months ago, he opens his garage and realizes, and then he plays them and realizes not only does he have footage of them descending on the land, but he also has the call between President Nixon and them when they've just landed on the moon. So he has 3 really cool pieces of history that he just kept because he didn't sell it to the TV studio to be overwritten. Could you imagine being the TV studio? They'd be like, oh, we overwrote history.
Whoopsies.
Oops.
I think it's just incredible. And of course, the young intern's name was Gary George, and it was 1976 that he got these. They were amongst 65 boxes of videotapes at a government surplus auction. It's just incredible how things just end up in the most random and weird places.
It is, and especially when we were just talking about the previous story of Australia having the official copy. It is important that these few official copies do exist with everything together, because things have been lost. This is one of the biggest moments in human history, but people weren't thinking about it, so things were lost. When we were looking at one of the exhibits in our visitor center about a part of the history of the observatory where we built what was called optical munitions, no records of anything existed because it was classified, but because we weren't part of the military, it didn't go to the National War Memorial, the National Archives. And we found out about all of the designs and plans because some engineer squirreled everything away because they were, they hoarded all the copies of their stuff. And that's how we found it. So it's all these little pieces of history that people will find that, as you say, turn up in the most amazing places.
Well, one thing that isn't lost, Brad, is NASA's Orion. We're sticking with the NASA theme here, and they've successfully completed an abort phase test, something that SpaceX failed a couple of months ago.
That's right. So the Orion capsule is NASA's new thing to get people into space. It's kind of like the replacement space shuttle, but not as big. It's more akin to the size of the Apollo capsule, very similar to the Dragon 2 capsule. And so the abort test is that critical phase where they put it on top of part of the rocket, usually the second stage, and they see, can it essentially jettison away from the rocket if something goes wrong, right? If it's going up and something's going wrong, can they safely get away? This was really important in December of past year when the Soyuz rocket had a malfunction, and this mechanism really saved the lives of the 2 astronauts on board the Soyuz capsule. There's a necessary part of this. And so it worked flawlessly. So it's another step of NASA and the Orion capsule getting ready for flight. They want to get it flying next year as a test. And as you said, we talked about this a couple months ago here on Talking Science, that the Dragon 2 failed this in Florida and caught on fire and was destroyed.
And it's one of those achievements that you hope you never actually need. But as you say, Soyuz has needed it. And there's been a couple of times in crewed missions where we have needed that abort stage. It is very critical to have everything in place.
And that's right. And it's not simple, as we saw with SpaceX's failure. And it doesn't say anything more negative about SpaceX versus better about NASA. These things are hard, and this is why you do the test to make sure it works. And this is why you keep doing your checks. And this is why, again, going back to the Apollo theme, everyone says, one of the great conspiracy theories is, why haven't we gone back to the moon since we went there, even though we went there in Apollos 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Besides that, why haven't we gone back since the Apollo era? And that was because once the Saturn V program stopped and the Apollo capsule didn't, and so they stopped building them. So not only was it expensive, but you don't have that technology ready, so you have to rebuild it. And there's a reason they call it rocket science. It's rocket science. It's hard. Things don't go into play. I mean, I always ask this question to people who say, why couldn't they just build a new rocket? Why couldn't you just build a new car? It's the same thing, but just rocket science. So it makes it tricky, but I'm glad to see NASA has had another good success.
And what's the difference between SpaceX's Dragon and NASA's Orion? What do you think the differences are?
SpaceX and NASA, and also we have to talk about Boeing's Starliner. Boeing and SpaceX are really being designed for just going into low Earth orbit at this point, docking with the space station, going around the Earth. the vision for Orion is really a capsule that will be suitable to get to the moon and potentially further afield to Mars. So it's built not just in size, it is fairly similar, but in terms of the life support system, the capability and the survivability of the craft to get there and back. They're all reusable. They're all designed to land in the ocean, be recovered again like Apollo, and then reflown. But the idea here is that Orion is designed really to go further away. So you change the system slightly. So if you don't have to worry about low Earth orbit, you have a system that's a bit different and able to go further away, which is why SpaceX and Boeing are important. They could take care of that vehicle for getting to nearby low Earth orbit, whereas NASA can focus on the further away missions. That's going to be probably the biggest difference that we're going to see now, because even when SpaceX talks about getting to Mars, they're talking about a different system than the Dragon 2.
When we're talking about flying further than the moon, of course, we're not quite there of getting to our next topic, which is, of course, GJ3470b, this mid-size planet, this super Earth that Hubble and Spitzer are working on.
That's right. So firstly, super Earth, this is not a planet that wears a cape. This is really Earth that is a bit bigger. So it's kind of an interesting class of planet where they're not as big as, say, the Neptunes and Uranuses, those big gas giants, but they're bigger than the Earths and rocky planets. And we think they're more similar to the rocky planets rather than the big gas giants. And they're quite common. From using Kepler Space Telescope, we think about 20% of all planetary systems have super Earths. And so Spitzer and Hubble, using data from Kepler, studied the atmosphere of one of these super Earths to figure out what they're made up of, what they're like. And it was really cool. What they found was a planet that has pretty much just a little bit of hydrogen and helium and nothing else. There's no carbon or oxygen or nitrogen, those sorts of things that we use here on Earth to breathe. There's no carbon dioxide like, say, Mars. It really is kind of interesting. In fact, it more resembles the atmosphere of the sun rather than any of the planets that we really have here in our solar system. So it's been a huge surprise, this whole planet, the whole way through.
And another big surprise is learning that it has a rocky core as well. It's got this gaseous atmosphere.
That's right. It has this sun-like gas atmosphere, not as big as the sun, but the composition. But on the inside, it's a rocky planet, just like Earth. So it'd be like living on Earth, but the air is like the sun, just colder. And so it's a really fascinating thing. We're in this new era of studying the atmospheres and the livability of planets around other stars, more than just discovering more of them. And we're really starting to get some surprises that, there's so many different things. And so when we think of, all of the worlds that may exist in the sci-fi universes, they really are diverse and they really are all over the place. And it's kind of a really cool thing.
Now, one thing I am wondering, Brad, is just how do we know what this atmosphere contains?
So this is a great question. So we do two techniques. And so one of the things that we do is essentially every element has its own fingerprint. So we call this spectroscopy. If you break up all of the colors of light, you can identify the signatures of every element. A great example is helium. In fact, it was an astronomer studying the sun back in the late 1800s. And when they looked at the composition of the sun, they discovered there's a new signature here. And so they called it helium, after the Greek word for helios, or sun. And so we can do this technique where we look at the light traveling through the atmosphere and we can see the signatures of the elements. And hydrogen and helium have clear signatures. And then so where Hubble and Spitzer were used is because Hubble looks in the blue and ultraviolet colors and Spitzer can look in the infrared. We can look at how it looks like in the blue, the optical, and the red, and get a measure of essentially how the colors change and therefore how the atmosphere changes. So kind of like why our sky is red at sunrise and sunset. It's the way light is reflected due to the composition. If you go to Mars, daytime is red on Mars, but sunrise and sunset is blue because it has a different atmosphere. So we literally applied that technique to this other planet to discover what it has. So it's a really cool thing. And this is what actually Australia is a world leader on. Is there's 3 instruments at Siding Spring being built and operating now just to exactly do this, to measure the atmospheres of other planets.
There is a bit involved in just looking at the planets as well. Hubble and Spitzer took 12 transits and 20 eclipses just to work out the composition of the super Earth. What else is in our neighbourhood that we could be looking at and looking into and finding?
Yeah, so this is a great question because a lot of these are either far away or, as you say, it takes tons of Hubble and Spitzer time. And that's because it's quite it is faint to see. And you also have to figure out what the contribution is from the planet versus the star. But they're now, so one of the goals of TESS, this new exoplanet finding telescope that's kind of the successor to Kepler, is to really do an inventory of all of the stars around our sun to exactly see what planets are nearby and what planets we can start doing this technique. And as bigger and bigger telescopes are built, like WFIRST or James Webb Space Telescope, it will start to be able to do this on further away or fainter planets and stars. It really will be the 2020 decade, just like in the 2000s and the 2010s, we came to this birth of not really knowing about planets around other stars. Keep in mind the first planet around another star was only discovered in 1992. The next decade will all be about focusing on the atmospheres and the composition of these planets.
And what does this allow us to learn moving forward?
So, firstly, it tells us kind of like how planets can come together, how they can form, how they can live. It also tells us kind of the composition of planets that can exist. When we think about life exist out there, you have to not only, we say it could be in the habitable zone, but a great example is in our solar system, Venus, Earth, and Mars are all in the habitable zone. Venus is 462 degrees and smells like rotten eggs and is a terrible place. Mars is a carbon dioxide atmosphere and frozen cold. So that's not good enough. We don't really know, can life exist or in the way we think life exists. So we really want to know. If we want to know how common planets and life are and how they formed, we need to see kind of the range of planetary systems that exist and actually what they're like. What are their temperatures like? What are their insides like? What are their atmospheres like?
Well, it's been a jam-packed edition of Talkin' Science, Brad. Some really fascinating things happening, some great things for NASA. Making up for their 1976 mistake of selling some B-roll. So, as always, Brad, thanks for talking science, and we'll catch you next week.
Sounds good.
Get exclusive access to podcasts and behind-the-scenes info of the show by becoming a member on Patreon today. Support Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek. Get even better with membership starting at just $1. Jump over to patreon.com/Trekzone.org.au. You can also get social with Trekzone. Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek is everywhere you are. Get the wrap-up on our Facebook page, keep in the loop on Twitter, and relive Trek episodes on Instagram. Plus, you can catch the latest podcasts on your favourite podcasting app. New content is being added all the time to Trekzone's YouTube channel. Talkin' Science, just like today, with Dr. Brad Tucker on Tuesdays. Trekzone Live on Thursdays following Vegas or Bust. And a Trekzone Conversation, the main show, on Saturdays. Don't miss a moment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be the first to know about new eps. And of course, as always, a huge thanks to Dr. Brad Tucker for his time and for bringing the stories to Trekzone. You can find him on Twitter at btucker22 and on Facebook, Dr. Brad Tucker. There's just 16 days to go until Trekzone's Vegas or Bust tour begins.